The Dormitory Curse. In a remote college located on the outskirts of Beijing, there stood an old dormitory building. 8 first-year female students with different personalities resided there: Emily, Sarah, Jessica, Rachel, Hannah, Lily, Megan, and Amber. The dormitory had a long history, and it was said that many strange incidents had occurred there long ago. However, the details had faded over time, leaving only faint memories. It was a cold night. The academic pressure in the first year of college was relatively light, especially compared to high school life. The students had plenty of free time, especially since this university wasn't even considered a key school. The 8 girls were sitting together, chatting about various topics. Emily suggested playing Pen Fairy to pass the time. Initially, everyone hesitated, but under her persistent encouragement, they eventually agreed. The game of Pen Fairy is an ancient ritual said to summon spirits who can communicate through a pen and convey messages from the spiritual realm. Although the girls felt uneasy about such a game, they decided to give it a try. Emily pulled out an old, yellowed piece of paper and a seemingly ordinary black fountain pen from her drawer, placing them gently in the center of the table. They gathered around, exchanging nervous glances. Although they laughed off the absurdity of the game, each of them couldn't help but feel a sense of unease deep down. "Are we really going to play this?" Sarah asked softly, her voice tinged with doubt. Emily smiled, trying to appear relaxed. "We're all adults now. Are you really afraid of a children's game?" "Don't worry, nothing will happen." With Emily's insistence, the 8 girls finally placed their hands lightly on the pen. They took a deep breath and, following Emily's lead, began chanting the summoning incantation together. Pen Fairy, are you there?" At first, the pen lay still on the paper, showing no signs of movement. The silence stretched on, and the tension in the room grew. Just as they were about to give up, the pen suddenly twitched slightly and then slowly began to move across the paper. As the pen moved, the 8 girls held their breath, their eyes fixed on the pen as it slowly glided across the paper. Their palms were sweaty. Despite their fear, curiosity and the thrill of the challenge kept them playing the game. "Pen Fairy, will I pass my exams?" Jessica was the first to break the silence, cautiously asking her question. She was an average student and felt a bit anxious about the upcoming exams. The pen paused for a moment, then slowly traced out the word, "Yes." Jessica let out a sigh of relief, a rare smile appearing on her face. "Will I find a boyfriend this year?" Sarah, who was slightly overweight, asked eagerly. In today's society, where most boys preferred slim and petite girls, she was not very popular. Her eyes sparkled with hope, as if seeking some comfort from the game. The pen moved again, this time spelling out the word, "No." Sarah's face fell instantly, but she quickly covered her disappointment with a self-deprecating smile. The other girls took turns asking their questions, and the Pen Fairy answered them one by one. Though the answers were a mix of good and bad, the overall atmosphere remained tense yet thrilling. However, as time went on, the questions grew bolder, even disrespectful. "Pen Fairy, do you really exist?" Lily asked provocatively, her skepticism about supernatural phenomena evident. The pen remained still on the paper for a long while, as if contemplating the question. Just when they thought the Pen Fairy wouldn't respond, the pen suddenly jerked and forcefully wrote the word, "Yes," startling everyone. Emily's expression changed slightly. She tried to end the game, but it felt as if an invisible force was controlling her hand, preventing her from moving. A chill crept up her spine. "Pen Fairy, how did you die? Was it painful?" Rachel suddenly asked, her tone laced with a hint of disrespect and mockery. The moment she spoke, the other girls froze, and the room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees. A collective shiver ran down their spines as fear gripped them. In an instant, the pen began to move violently across the paper as if expressing a furious rage. The girls' hands moved uncontrollably with the pen, unable to stop it. The paper quickly filled with chaotic scribbles, until the pen finally stopped in front of Rachel, its tip pointing directly at her finger. Then, something horrifying happened. The pen tip suddenly stabbed into Rachel's finger, drawing blood that quickly stained the paper and the table. As if guided by the blood, the pen began moving again, writing a chilling message that made everyone shiver. Disrespect. You all will die. The room fell into a deathly silence. The 7 white candles they had lit for the pen fairy ritual were suddenly extinguished by an unknown gust of wind. Darkness enveloped the room, and with a loud pop, the light bulb in the room exploded, sending shards of glass flying everywhere. The girls were terrified, their faces pale. They realized that the pen fairy game was not just harmless fun, it had become a deadly curse. All of this had begun because they had broken the pen fairy's taboo by showing disrespect and provocation. In their panic, Emily quickly tried to end the game, shouting, "We have to end this game now." She desperately tried to remove the paper and pen from the table, but no matter how hard she tried, the pen seemed glued to the paper, refusing to budge. The room was filled with an oppressive silence, the only sound being the girls' ragged breathing. In the darkness, they could hear faint whispers, growing louder and filled with endless resentment and malice. But no one could understand what was being said. Their breaths quickened, and their heartbeats pounded like the tolling of a death knell. Suddenly, the window was blown open by a fierce wind, sending cold air and fine dust swirling into the room, accompanied by more ominous noises. They hurriedly turned on their flashlights, frantically searching the room, but could see nothing. As the flashlight beams swept across the walls, they noticed red handprints appearing on the wall as if a hand was reaching out from inside the wall, trying to grab something. The atmosphere in the dormitory seemed to freeze, and they felt a strong sense of malevolence closing in on them from all sides, threatening to swallow them whole. "Run!" Rachel screamed, but her voice was weak and powerless amidst the chaos. The girls scrambled towards the dormitory door, only to find that the doorknob was as cold as iron, and no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't open it. In that instant, they realized they were trapped with no way out. In the darkness, Rachel felt an icy hand grab her shoulder from behind. She spun around, only to see a pair of blood-red eyes, staring at her from the shadows. She tried to scream, but her voice was stuck in her throat, unable to escape. Rachel's heart pounded like a drum, and the blood-red eyes seemed to be devouring her soul. She yanked herself free from the icy grip, stumbling backward, but her foot slipped, and she fell to the ground. As she tried to get up, she heard a rustling sound behind her as if something was crawling across the floor. She turned her head, and the sight that met her eyes nearly froze her blood. The floor had cracked open, and a pale, bony hand was slowly emerging from the gap. The hand's long, sharp nails reeked of decay, as it crawled closer to her, as if trying to drag her into the darkness. Rachel tried to scoot away, but no matter how hard she tried, her body seemed nailed to the floor, completely immobile. The hand finally reached her ankle, its icy touch sending a jolt of terror through her. She screamed, but her voice was suddenly cut off as an immense pain erupted in her chest, as if something was twisting inside her. Blood welled up in her throat, and with a violent cough, it sprayed out, splattering the floor. Her vision blurred, and she felt herself slipping into unconsciousness. The last thing she saw was those blood-red eyes staring down at her, watching her futile struggle. Rachel's body convulsed on the floor, then fell still. Her eyes remained wide open, filled with fear, but life had already drained from her body. The bony hand slowly withdrew back into the floor, leaving no trace of its presence. The other girls, awakened by Rachel's screams, scrambled out of their beds, turning on their phones' flashlights. They were horrified to find Rachel's lifeless body lying on the floor, her vacant eyes staring into nothingness, with a pool of blood spreading around her. After witnessing Rachel's gruesome death, the girls' fear and anxiety reached a peak. They huddled together, trying to figure out what was happening, but Rachel's blood-red eyes haunted their minds. They began to suspect that the pen fairy game had indeed summoned something they shouldn't have. At that moment, Emily's phone suddenly lit up with a text message: "You must return to the dorm before lights out, or face the consequences." The message was brief and chilling, with no sender's name, but its content made everyone gasp. It was as if the pen fairy itself was warning them. Amber was the first to break the silence, her voice trembling as she said, "We have to heed this warning. We can't stay outside. If we do, we'll end up like Rachel. However, Jessica, who was already on the brink of a breakdown, shouted, I can't stay in this cursed place any longer. I can't take it. I'm moving out right now. The others tried to stop her, but Jessica's fear had completely overtaken her. She ignored their pleas, hurriedly packed a few clothes, grabbed her belongings, and bolted out of the dormitory. Jessica, don't go. Look at this warning. Emily grabbed her arm, trying to stop her. You can't leave after lights out. But Jessica had lost all sense of reason. She yanked her arm free from Emily's grasp and ran out of the dormitory building, nearly sprinting. Her only thought was to get as far away from that cursed place as possible. She kept running until she reached a small motel just outside the campus. She hastily checked in, locked herself in the room, and only then did her heart begin to calm down. She thought she was safe, having escaped that terrifying place. Exhausted, she lay down on the bed, and soon drifted into a light sleep. However, just as she closed her eyes, the room's lights suddenly went out. In the pitch darkness, she heard the sound of slow, heavy footsteps, as if something was creeping closer. Jessica snapped her eyes open, but the room was completely dark. She fumbled on the bedside table, trying to find her phone, but her hand found no thing. The footsteps grew louder, heavier, and her heart pounded in her chest. Suddenly, she felt something cold touch her ankle, a chilling sensation that seemed to freeze her soul. She tried to sit up and jump out of bed, but her legs felt like they were nailed to the bed, unable to move. In the darkness, she felt an icy hand slowly crawl up her leg. The hand had sharp, claw-like nails that scraped against her skin, sending waves of pain through her body. She wanted to scream, but it was as if something was choking her, preventing any sound from escaping. As her consciousness began to fade, she saw those same blood-red eyes she had seen in the dormitory, gleaming in the darkness. The eyes were filled with malicious glee, mocking her fear and stupidity. Her body convulsed violently as the icy fingers climbed higher, finally wrapping around her throat. Jessica's breathing became labored, and her vision blurred until she lost consciousness, collapsing lifelessly onto the bed. When the first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains in the morning, Jessica's body was already cold and stiff. Her eyes were wide open, her face etched with fear and despair. Clear fingerprints were visible on her neck, as if she had been strangled by an unseen force. Meanwhile, back at the dormitory, the other girls had spent a sleepless night. They knew that Jessica's departure would only bring greater disaster, and that they, too, would inevitably meet the same fate as Rachel and Jessica. Their lives were now under the control of the Pen Fairy, and the shadow of death was closing in. Hannah, the calmest of the group, suggested that they thoroughly investigate the history of the dormitory to uncover the hidden truth. They delved into the school's archives and finally uncovered some disturbing clues. It turned out that many years ago, a murder had occurred in the dormitory. A girl who had been bullied and humiliated by her classmates could no longer bear the torment and took her own life. Before she died, she wrote a curse with a pen, vowing to make her tormentors pay. After the girl's death, strange and deadly incidents began to happen in the dormitory. Although the school administration tried to cover it up, rumors spread. Hannah and the others realized that they might have inadvertently triggered the girl's curse, and now, they were being drawn into the same fate. Knowing the truth, the girls felt a glimmer of hope. They decided to visit the girl's grave, hoping to ask for her forgiveness and see if they could quell her anger. However, when they arrived at the graveyard, they were met with a disheartening sight. The girl's tombstone had been shattered, and the grave had been dug up, leaving it empty. They felt a deep sense of despair, realizing that the girl's spirit was still wandering, her anger unresolved. As they were about to leave, the sky suddenly darkened, and the atmosphere around them grew eerie. The air in the graveyard seemed to thicken, with gusts of chilling wind swirling around them as if unseen eyes were watching our every move. The next morning after leaving the graveyard, Hannah was still captivated by the story of the deceased girl, and resolved to continue investigating her background. She locked herself in her dorm room, poring over old archives and books on paranormal phenomena, hoping to find any connection to the curse. The atmosphere in the room grew increasingly oppressive as she worked late into the night, alone. That night, as Hannah was sorting through her newly discovered clues, she suddenly heard a deep, ominous tolling of a bell in the distance. The sound seemed to resonate from deep underground, carrying an inexplicable sense of foreboding that sent a chill down her spine. She looked around, only to find the dormitory as empty as ever, with the other girls already in bed. The bell's toll faded, but the cold in the air persisted, growing more intense. Just as Hannah was about to continue her research, a sinister female voice suddenly whispered in her ear, dripping with icy laughter, "Do you think you're smart?" Hannah spun around, but there was no one in sight. Her heart raced, and cold sweat broke out on her forehead, but she forced herself to stay calm and resumed reading the documents in her hand. However, the voice returned, closer this time, as if it was right behind her. "Do you think you can escape?" Her breathing became rapid as she felt an icy presence creeping closer. She tried to stand up and flee the room, but her body seemed bound by an invisible force, unable to move. The cold seeped into her bones, chilling her to the core. Suddenly, the lights in the room began to flicker, and the tolling of the bell grew louder and more urgent. Hannah's vision started to blur, and the objects in the room appeared to warp and twist. Faces began to emerge on the walls, distorted with pain and despair, silently screaming. Her mind was filled with a cacophony of voices, whispering prophecies of doom in her ears. "You aren't smarter than me." The voice grew even darker. "You're just the next victim." Hannah's eyes began to glaze over as she struggled to cry out, but her throat felt as though it was blocked by something, preventing any sound. Her body trembled violently, and her consciousness began to slip away. At that moment, the faces on the walls suddenly lunged at her with an overwhelming sense of malice, tearing at her soul. Hannah felt herself being dragged into a dark abyss by some unseen force. She fought to escape, but it was no use. The cold voice echoed in her ears, "You're nothing but a scapegoat." Finally, Hannah's body went still, her eyes vacant and lifeless. The dormitory fell silent once more, as if nothing had happened. Hannah's body was found slumped by her desk, her face frozen in an expression of terror and agony. When the other girls discovered her the next morning, they saw that she was still clutching a book on paranormal phenomena, its pages stained with her cold blood. Her once curious eyes were now devoid of life, staring into an empty void. Hannah's death deepened the fear within the dormitory, and the girls knew they couldn't escape this curse. After Hannah's funeral, Sarah was in a state of extreme panic. Hannah's death left her deeply unsettled, and she decided to leave the dormitory for good and return home to escape the evil forces at play. However, before leaving, she decided to visit the school library one last time to research more about the paranormal, hoping to find a way to break the Pen Fairy curse. The following night, Sarah sat alone in the empty library, surrounded by silence. She was flipping through an ancient book when suddenly, she heard a deep, ominous bell tolling. The sound seemed to come from beneath the earth, carrying a sense of doom. She looked up, and the lights around her dimmed, shrouding the entire library in a grayish haze. Sarah felt deeply uneasy. She quickly closed the book and prepared to leave the library. However, as she stood up, she suddenly felt the ground beneath her begin to tremble as if some force was surging from beneath. She looked around, trying to find the source of the vibration, but the library was empty except for the constant echo of the bell. She started running toward the exit, but no matter how far she ran, the library's exit seemed to stretch endlessly, always just out of reach. Her panic grew, and her breathing became frantic. Then, she suddenly felt a strong, choking sensation as if something invisible was gripping her throat. Sarah struggled desperately, trying to break free from the unseen force, but her body grew weaker under the pressure. Her vision blurred, and everything around her distorted. In her final moments, she felt as if some unseen power slammed her to the ground, and her voice was silent. The next morning, the librarian found Sarah's body. A deep, unmistakable bruise circled her neck, as if she had been strangled by an invisible hand. Her eyes were wide open, her face frozen in an expression of pure terror and despair. The night following Sarah's death, Lily's anxiety reached its peak. She had spent the entire night cleaning the dormitory, hoping that the act of cleaning would help dispel the fear that had taken root in her heart. As Lily was scrubbing the bathroom, she suddenly noticed a small pool of blood on the floor. No matter how hard she scrubbed, the blood wouldn't disappear. Instead, it spread, growing larger and larger. Panic welled up inside her as she watched in horror as blood began to flow from the faucet, filling the entire bathroom. When Lily realized she was trapped in the bathroom, the blood had already risen to her ankles. She desperately tried to escape, but the door seemed to be locked from the outside, refusing to budge no matter how hard she pulled. The blood quickly rose, engulfing her knees, waist, and eventually filling the entire bathroom. Lily struggled in the blood, feeling cold, and seeing hands pulling her down into the depths. The next morning, her roommates found the bathroom filled with blood, with Lily's body crammed into the sink. A twisted smile lingered on her face, her wide eyes filled with terror. Lily's death plunged the dormitory into an even deeper state of fear. Megan, who had always been the one who loved snacks the most, found her appetite dwindling in the wake of the recent horrors. The night after Lily's death, Megan was suddenly overcome with an insatiable hunger. She reached for a bag of her favorite candy, hoping it would calm her nerves. However, the moment the first piece touched her tongue, she felt a sharp pain shoot through her mouth. Rushing to the mirror, she was horrified to see her teeth falling out one by one, her mouth rapidly filling with blood. Megan tried to stem the bleeding, but the blood only flowed faster, draining her life away. As her skin turned pale, and she grew weaker, she collapsed to the floor. The following morning, her roommates found her lifeless body on the floor, her mouth stuffed with her own fallen teeth, her face as white as a sheet, as if all the life had been drained from her. After Megan's death, Amber faced her own nightmare that night. She was the quietest girl in the dormitory, introverted and fond of reading and writing. Despite the fear that had gripped the dormitory, she continued her habit of writing in her journal, hoping that by putting her fears into words, she could find some relief. On the fourth night, Amber was alone at her desk, writing in her journal, when she suddenly heard a whisper in her ear, calling her name. She looked around, but saw no one. She continued writing, but her hands started moving uncontrollably, as if guided by an unseen force. She tried to stop, but her hand refused to obey, scribbling more and more bizarre sentences, all of them predicting death and curses. Suddenly, her hand began to spasm, the pen digging into her palm, drawing blood. By the time her roommates found her, she was slumped over her desk. The pen stabbed through her hand, blood soaking the pages of her journal. A strange smile was frozen on her face, her eyes slightly open as if still staring at something horrifying. Finally, it was Emily's turn, the one who had originally suggested playing the pen fairy game. Despite witnessing the horrific deaths of her friends, she had tried to escape from reality, pretending that none of it had happened. However, she couldn't escape the fate that awaited her. On the fifth night, Emily sat alone in the dormitory when she suddenly heard the familiar whispering voice in her ear. It was the pen fairy, calling her name. She felt a chill run down her spine, and found herself unable to resist picking up a pen, and beginning to write on a piece of paper. Her hand moved uncontrollably across the paper, each stroke deepening her fear. A distorted face gradually appeared on the page. It was the face of the girl who had originally been cursed, her eyes filled with hatred and resentment. Emily realized that the pen fairy's curse had sealed her fate from the very beginning. Suddenly, the face on the paper twisted even further, as if trying to crawl out of the page. Emily wanted to run, but her body wouldn't move. She could only watch in horror as the face materialized in front of her, transforming into a physical entity. The ghost of the girl slowly approached her, reaching out with cold fingers that lightly brushed across Emily's face. Emily's eyes widened in terror as she felt her soul being slowly pulled out of her body. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Finally, her body was torn apart by an invisible force, and her soul was completely devoured by the pen fairy, leaving behind only an empty shell. The next morning, when the others found her, Emily's lifeless body was sitting rigidly at her desk, her eyes wide open in terror. The last word she had written on the paper was, "Die." The eerie deaths of these 8 girls eventually became a taboo topic on campus, and the dormitory was sealed off, never to be approached again. But it was said that on quiet, dark nights, one could still hear faint whispers, and the sound of a pen scratching on paper from within. The abandoned building. The dormitory building had once been part of an orphanage, where decades ago, a horrifying tragedy had occurred. A cruel matron had brutally abused and killed several innocent orphans, burying their bodies in the courtyard and disguising their deaths as accidents. These children, filled with deep resentment, refused to leave after death and eventually possessed the matron, driving her mad until she hanged herself in one of the dormitory rooms. Even after the matron's death, her spirit couldn't rest in peace, tormented by the vengeful spirits of the children. She remained trapped in the dormitory building, and whenever students played the pen fairy game, the curse would awaken, leading to a series of tragedies. These vengeful spirits had only one goal: revenge. In life, they had been tormented and killed without reason. In death, they found no peace. All they could do was unleash their wrath on anyone who dared disturb them. The students who summoned them became the targets of their vengeance. These 8 girls were merely the latest in a long line of victims. Anyone who played the pen fairy game was doomed to die. Ultimately, the girls all met their fates, consumed by the curse. The spirits didn't stop with the last girl's death. Their hatred and pain lingered in every brick and stone of the dormitory. In the years that followed, the campus was plagued by unexplained events. Students reported seeing apparitions, hearing faint crying, and even glimpsing the faces of the dead girls in mirrors. Fear spread rapidly, and many students chose to leave the school or move out of the dormitory. The school administration tried to cover up the incidents, even bringing in exorcists and priests to perform rituals, but nothing worked. Every time an exorcist entered the notorious room, they were met with an overwhelming force that drove them away in terror. Finally, the school had no choice but to permanently seal off the dormitory, abandoning it to time. But this did nothing to quell the spirits' anger. As the years passed, the dormitory was forgotten, becoming a forbidden zone on campus, avoided by all. There were rumors that on quiet, dark nights, the sound of faint crying and eerie laughter could still be heard from the abandoned dormitory, as if the spirits were still wandering, searching for new victims. Though the school tried to suppress the story, it continued to be whispered among those in the know, becoming a terrifying legend passed down through generations of students. The warning was clear: never play the pen fairy game, and never enter that dormitory, for the shadows of the vengeful spirits had never left, and their thirst for revenge would never be satisfied. In this school, the tale of the 8 girls and their fate became a forbidden topic, never spoken of lightly. But every new student who arrived on campus would hear a whispered warning: never play the pen fairy game, and never go near that dormitory. For within its walls, the spirits still lingered, waiting for the next soul to awaken their wrath. This terrifying story has no victors. The spirits' revenge was never complete, and the dormitory remained a cursed place where anyone who dared approach would meet their end. The students died one by one, in terror and despair, with no one left to break the curse. The history of the campus would forever bear the memory of these innocent souls, and the shadow of the dormitory would continue to haunt every student who passed through, becoming an inescapable nightmare. In this school, the story of the 8 girls and their tragic fate became a taboo topic, never spoken of openly. But every new student would hear the whispered warning: never play the pen fairy game, and never enter that dormitory. For in that place, the spirits' shadows lingered, and their thirst for revenge would never be quenched. The terror of the story did not end, for in the depths of the abandoned dormitory, endless darkness still lurked, waiting for a new soul to awaken the spirits.